Welcome to this special post-election edition of the station, Kentucky's Conservative Outpost. This is the anchor show for Kentucky's Voice, the Commonwealth's statewide conservative media outlet, offering news and analysis from a conservative and a Christian point of view. I'm Jim Waters, your host today, and I'm joined by my co-host, Bob Scott, a longtime voice for conservatism in Kentucky and an influential activist for conservative causes. Great to see you, Bob, today. Thanks for taking time to join us today as well. Well, we've had a primary election, folks, recently, in which the trend that we've seen happening in Kentucky is continuing. Kentucky was already getting red, and I think redder, if that's a word, is where what happened in this election, redder and redder. And joining us to discuss how this trend continued in this primary election and to offer other discussion and analysis is Richard Nelson, founder and executive director of the Commonwealth Policy Center. Richard, thanks for taking some time here to join us. I know you're getting ready to head off on a vacation, so we appreciate you taking some time out to join us to talk about, I think, a very important election season here and result. One thing I was disappointed in was the turnout. The turnout was even lower than what Secretary of State Michael Adams had thought it might be. In some areas, it was higher. I know down in the Bowling Green area and that area, it was actually up in the 20% range, above 20%, but most of the state was under 13%, I think. So anyhow, what are your thoughts on this election? Just generally overall, what happened, and then we can get into more of the specifics here today.
Jim, it's great to be with you on the program. Always good to be on WBNA TV 21. So it was interesting. You had a couple dynamics. One is the turnout was low because the presidential ticket has been settled. Democrats are going with Joe Biden. Republicans are going with Donald Trump. That's been settled for a couple months now. And I think that kept a lot of voters home. They're like, well, my vote doesn't matter. Why should I go and vote? Here in Franklin County, where I reside, that was the only race on the Republican ballot. Mm-hmm. And turnout here, I think, was probably close to 12% or so. On the Democratic side, though, they had many other people to vote for here in Franklin County. Franklin County still is a Democratic county. So there was a House primary that was on the ballot. You had a couple of local offices, the PVA and the jailer was on the ballot. So that did bring more people to the polls. You mentioned Bowling Green. Mm-hmm. There was a contested House primary there, and that resulted in a higher turnout. So I think one of the lessons is that when you have competitive races where you see a lot of advertising, it is going to draw more people to the polls. My personal conviction, Jim, is that as good citizens, we should vote whenever there's an election, even if it might be a foregone conclusion. Just to exercise our right to vote is important. Just to show up. It's our civic duty. It's important to it sends a message that we care and to really honor those who made an incredible sacrifice for us to vote. Anyways, those those are some thoughts on the as far as the turnout. Now that we're going to see a different number in the fall, that's when the presidential candidates are on the ballot, and we're going to see a turnout that's probably much higher than that. So,
just a side note on the presidential race on the Democratic side, there were a lot of. I forgot what they call the category. There were a lot of folks that voted Democratic but didn't want Biden in Kentucky. What's that? What was that called? There was
uncommitted. Those were uncommitted. Very high number. Biden only had like 71%, I want to say, if memory serves. Mm-hmm. Uncommitted was double digits, 20-some percent, 18%, something like that. Very, very high, which shows it shows the dissatisfaction that Democratic voters have with Joe Biden. They showed up, Jim. They showed up, but they made a statement that, hey, we don't really agree with Joe Biden. We can't get behind him, so they're voting uncommitted.
Well, you know, guys, we're seeing, let's get down into what happened now in this election. It was a good night for It was a good night for the banner policy issue of school choice in our state. Let's talk about that first. We saw where opponents of school choice really took a pretty good thrashing, with some exceptions. Representative Michael Meredith down in the Bowling Green area did win in his primary, and there was a lot of dirt being slung, I think, both ways in that race. But and he's voted against school choice and has gotten money from the teachers unions. But that was the exception on this election. The norm was, we saw in Lexington and in Northern Kentucky in particular, and other places, that school choice supporters really had a very good night. I think that bodes well for a constitutional amendment in the fall election. What do you guys think?
Yeah, Jim, I agree. I think that school choice won at the ballot box. I want to take a step back, though, and set this up. Kentucky is a deep red state across the board, except for the governor's mansion. In the state house, 80 out of 100 seats are held by Republicans. In the state Senate, 31 out of 38 seats are held by Republicans. So I don't know how much redder Kentucky can get, as you mentioned in your opening comments. But really what was going on in this primary election was, how conservative will Republicans be? And you had the backstory in all of this, really not been covered well, is that you had two Republican super PACs engaged to defeat principled conservatives at the ballot box. Largely in the state house, you had these two PACs. One was called Commonwealth Conservative Coalition. The other one was called Common Sense Kentucky. They were headed by Republicans, but Jim, they received money from groups like Churchill Downs. They received a large chunk of their money from a group called Better Schools Kentucky, which was the political action arm of the Jefferson County Teachers Association. They got raised well over $1 million specifically to elect moderates and to defeat conservatives. And these two groups significantly underperformed. The only race that really where they were significantly involved with was the race that you mentioned in Bowling Green. Michael Meredith, who is anti-school choice, he's pro gambling expansion. He won that race, and he was their candidate to get reelected. However, he faced a challenger who was not the strongest candidate, had some baggage and some real issues there. But in all the other races, Jim, especially in Northern Kentucky, Steve Doan was targeted. Marianne Proctor was targeted. Over in Bardstown, Candy Massaroni was a target. You had incumbents, House incumbents, who were proven conservatives. They were pro-school choice. They were pro-life. They had a conservative voting record. They were targeted in each of these races. The conservatives were outspent. They had big organizations opposed to them, like the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, some other influential people that came up short.
Conservative, I might add.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Bob. Absolutely,
well,
and this
we saw that over in Lexington
when
too.
You look at the players, you look at the money, you look at the influential organizations. Conservatism won the day on Tuesday, and that's something where I think a lot of people in if we could put it this way, the mainstream of the Republican Party, of the Republican power holders, they're probably shaking their heads. They're seeing that the money did not achieve what they wanted it to. They're seeing that the endorsements, for example, by the Chamber of Commerce, that didn't matter. The Chamber of Commerce, by the way, endorsed 21 candidates. Only 11 of those candidates won. That's a 52% success rate.
And that
contrast that with Kentucky Right to Life.
Yeah,
Kentucky Right to Life endorsed 23. They won 19. That's an 83% success rate. I think that's a pretty good contrast. Socially conservative, pro-life group, 83% success rate in their endorsements. The Kentucky Chamber, which I would argue is left-leaning now. Their policies have shifted in the last couple of years. They're hostile in some respects to some socially conservative policies. Their stamp, their endorsement really did not play well or help help
and that may be
their cause.
that may be a better indication of how conservative we're getting is those things in terms of the truly conservative candidates winning.
We are here to defend democracy.
Misinformation poses a threat to our nation's health.
Climate change is an emergency.
Democratic socialism.
Codify women's right to choose.
Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15.
Killian Timoney over in Lexington. A lot of money was poured into his race by those groups opposed to school choice and who wanted more moderate Republicans to win. So, in the past, we've seen this in northern Kentucky, but it really was in other parts of the state, Richard, this time as well.
Absolutely. Jim, let's talk about Killian Timoney for just a moment. Killian had combined spending of over $300,000. It could be more when the final reports are made, but Killian Timoney was probably the most liberal Republican in the House Republican caucus. He voted against the Fairness in Women's Sports Act. He voted against Senate Bill 150 last year, which stopped gender dysphoric minors from pursuing puberty blockers and transition surgeries, kept boys in the boys' bathrooms, girls in the girls' bathrooms in public schools. Killian Timoney was on the left-leaning side on so many of these issues, against school choice, supported gambling expansion. Huge amount of money spent to help him get reelected. By the way, Killian's a nice guy.
Yeah,
he's a friendly guy,
yeah,
capable person, by the way.
Yeah.
But he did not represent the values of Republican primary voters.
Right.
On the other hand, you had a Republican challenger by the name of Thomas Jefferson. Of all the names you could have as a political candidate, how would you like a name like that, Jim? Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was outspent by a huge margin. I think it was a 7-1 margin, something like that. But he was a true conservative. He was a capable person, aggressively campaigned. Thomas Jefferson beat the sitting incumbent Killian Timoney by a 3-1 margin, roughly 75 to 25% margin. And that was a wake-up call, I think, again, to people who are looking at the races. Some who are saying, look, Killian Timoney just represented his district. I think there's a bigger question to ask is, did he represent the values of the Republican Party and specifically to primary voters? The answer was a resounding no, and that's what the voters in that Lexington district said is no, we don't want Killian Timoney to come back and represent us. Well, so I think that race was indicative of the sentiments of Republican voters. Yeah. It showcased social issues, if you will, and it underscored this point that we need to make over and over, that big money cannot replace principled conservative candidates.
Yeah, Richard, out in Western Kentucky, though, surprised to me that Richard Heath, who was the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, any insight into what happened there in that race? And he also, I think, lost to a more conservative candidate. So maybe that's just following the trend that we've seen. But it's happened all over the state.
Jim, that was a shock to many of us. I had Richard Heath in the CPC studio just a few weeks ago. And I would say that Richard is a conservative, very pro-life, smaller government. But a couple things happened. One, as I understood from listening in on some conversations, that it probably didn't help him that he ran 2 statewide campaigns, gave the appearance that he was just maybe angling for a higher office and using his place in the legislature as a stepping stone. And number 2, maybe not involved with local issues and staying in touch with key local people like he should have. And I say that just as objective analysis. I think Richard was a fine representative, very influential as the chairman of the House Ag Committee, and had a conservative voting record. But one of the things that happened too was that the issue of when tax reform was going through the legislature a couple years ago, they had to offset the decrease in the state income tax with increasing taxes on certain service industries. That didn't go over well with a lot of people, and especially when they had to pick a certain number of those industries, 16, 17, 18, something like that. And if you're a car mechanic, or if you have a bowling alley, or one of those industries that was had new taxes on them, didn't go over well, and Richard got dinged for that. And his opponent, Kim Holloway,
We are here to defend democracy.
Misinformation poses a threat to our nation's health.
Climate change is an emergency.
Democratic socialism.
Codify women's right to choose.
Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15.
Republican who chairs the House Health Services Committee. They donated a big chunk to help her get reelected. Now, Kim Moser was against Senate Bill 150. She's on record as voting against that bill that would stop minors from pursuing puberty blockers and hormone therapy and gender transition surgeries. So that is an issue that we thought it was behind us, kind of in the rearview mirror. I don't think it's done. When you see a political action committee form that's going to raise money and then help candidates, particularly Republican candidates, to get reelected who are siding with them, that tells me that that's going to be an issue going on into the future.
You know, you mentioned the House leadership, and most of those guys signed on for school choice. Going back to that for a moment, but my observation is that we've definitely become more conservative, and there's been a lot more conservative unity around economic and education choice issues. But when it seems like the divide here, as you mentioned, has been in the caucus has been on the social and cultural issues. So that seems to be where. But again, the message was sent the other night that Kentuckians are conservative, and they are socially conservative. They're culturally conservative. And even those like Representative Meredith, who did oppose school choice, but he was on the right side on some other issues, pro-life and some other cultural, I think, issues, social issues. So the message got sent, and at some point in time, we're going to have so many conservatives up there in Frankfort that the leadership will have to have truly conservative chairmen, and people in positions of leadership. So. Yep.
Yeah, Jim, we saw it to that point about social issues making a difference. Social issues and cultural conservatism is important to Kentuckians across, especially when you move away from Lexington to Louisville. You get into West Kentucky, South Central Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky. Social and moral issues do matter. I think of, for example, the race in Bardstown, that's House District 50. Candy Massaroni is a first-term Republican, very socially conservative, solid voting record. And she had a challenger, Andy Stone, who's on the school board there, who at a forum, he defended objectionable books in the public schools. And that objectionable is probably putting it mildly, pornographic books, which are found in some of our public school libraries. Andy Stone did not have a solid, nope, this is wrong, this is inappropriate, it should not be in our public schools. Candy Massaroni, on the other hand, took a strong stand on that issue. There's no equivocation on the appropriateness of those books in the public schools. I say that because that was one distinguishing issue in that race. Candy Massaroni, very much pro school choice. Andy Stone, I believe, equivocated on that issue. So when it came to some core convictional issues, you had, I think it's fair to say, Andy Stone, the moderate candidate, who didn't articulate well on some of the issues, against a solid conservative who's voted on some of these things. She prevailed. Candy Massaroni prevailed. She was outspent, by the way, in that race, $209,000 to $81,000. Now, the outcome was this. It was 2-1. She won 64 to 36%, even though she was outspent by about almost a 3-1, 2.5 to 1 margin. So it tells me, Jim, that convictions matter, that you should know where you stand on the issues. You should be socially conservative. If you're going to run in a Republican primary, you need to know the issues, articulate the issues, and be on the right side of those issues. And they do matter in Republican primaries.
Yeah, well, let's look ahead, guys, Bob and Richard, to the general election here in Kentucky. We're going to have some interesting races here, I think, and it looks like the Republicans are in pretty good shape for this fall. Is that your assessment? And what are you guys going to be looking at? What are things you're concerned about, and what are things you're optimistic about for this fall?
Yeah. Jim, there was, even before going into the primary, there were a number of Republicans who filed for open seats, and Democrats could not field a challenger. I'm thinking in the 3rd district of the Senate, Whitney Westerfield's leaving. He had a Republican that filed, and there's no Democratic challenger. So that's one Senate seat where a person's just walking in without a challenger. In Henderson, in the House 11 district, you have a senator, a House member who's leaving, and Jonathan Dixon. He's been there for, I want to say, 2-3 terms maybe. And you have a very young guy that's walking in without a challenger. That's almost unheard of in Henderson, which is an outlier, Democratic stronghold in Western Kentucky. Yeah. So there may be some other races
that happened. To be very frank with you.
Yeah. So you have that, and then to the point about the general. Well, many of the general elections have been settled in the primary. And I recall 15, 20 years ago when it was Democrats that had huge majorities in the House and Senate. Well, in the House anyway, not in the Senate. Yeah. But those who would serve in Frankfort, they was settled in the primaries. Now we're seeing this happen on the Republican side because people realize they can't win as Democrats if they're going to go serve in the state house. So a large number of the general election winners were settled just a couple days ago. I think we tallied just a handful of competitive races in Kentucky in the state house, where you will have a Democrat and a Republican on the ballot in November. One of those, by the way, is Killian Timoney's seat in Lexington. Mm-hmm. Killian lost, of course. Thomas Jefferson won the Republican primary. There's a very strong Democratic challenger there. He's well-funded. He's an ally of Governor Beshear's, and that will be a contested race. But essentially, we just gauge a handful or so of races that are competitive. I don't know if the outcome of the makeup of the state house will change. Republicans have everything to lose. I mean, they've really outperformed in the last couple of elections, and they've won in districts that they've not won before. So, for example, in Louisville, You have Republicans that have picked up seats there. We might have a few Republicans vulnerable because we have open seats. So, for example, Kevin Bratcher, longtime member of the State House, he left to run for the Metro Council. And there's a person who won the Republican primary, Chris Lewis, I believe. And I think there's a Democratic challenger there. We have races like that where Republicans have a chance, if it's not a strong Republican candidate, or if it's in a strong left-leaning Democratic district, Republicans do have a chance to lose a couple seats. However, with that said, I don't think there's cause for alarm. Even if Democrats picked up a couple seats in the House, maybe even a seat in the Senate, I don't think that's cause for alarm, because here's the bottom line. The Republican House caucus is now more conservative than it was before the election. And they're emboldened because many of those very conservative House incumbents that were targeted prevailed, and they won, and not just won, but they won by pretty wide margins for the most part.
And even with the more moderate members that were there, they had supermajority status, so they really held Bashir in check in terms of veto override ability. So that's even going to get stronger with more Republican members, I think, here. Yeah.
That's right.
Well, hey, guys, thank you. We're out of time today. But thanks to Richard Nelson, founder, executive director of the Commonwealth Policy Center, my co-host, Bob Scott. I'm Jim Waters. Thanks for joining us here on the station, Kentucky's conservative outpost, the anchor show for Kentucky's Voice, the only statewide conservative media outlet in the Commonwealth offering news and analysis from a conservative Christian point of view. Thank you, and join us next time right here on the station.